The wedding was perfect. Every detail, from the delicate white roses woven into her veil to the golden chandeliers casting a warm glow over the grand ballroom, seemed like something out of a fairy tale. She had waited for this moment for years, dreaming of the day she would finally belong to him, body and soul. As she looked at him, her husband, her heart swelled with love. His suit was tailored to perfection, his dark eyes unreadable as he accepted the endless congratulations from their guests. He was everything she had ever wanted. But the moment his gaze met hers, something in her stomach twisted. There was no warmth in his eyes. No joy. Only calculation. The unease crept in slowly, like a cold whisper against her skin. But she ignored it. He was a reserved man. She had always known that. Maybe it was just the overwhelming nature of the evening. Maybe he was tired. Or maybe something was terribly wrong. When they finally retired to their wedding suite, she expected a moment of tenderness. A quiet, intimate celebration of their love. Instead, he removed his cufflinks with an air of finality and turned to her with a sharp, emotionless gaze. "You got what you wanted," he said. "You're my wife now. Are you happy?" She blinked. "Of course, Good," he interrupted. "Because this is the last happy moment you'll have with me." Her breath caught in her throat. What do you mean?" He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "You spent years chasing after me, loving me, waiting for me. But you never stopped to ask yourself why I finally agreed to marry you." Her heart pounded. "What are you saying?" His smirk was cruel. "You ruined my life, and now I'm going to ruin yours." The world tilted. She stumbled back, her wedding gown feeling like a suffocating cage. "I don't understand. I've never." "Oh, but you have." His voice was laced with cold amusement. "You just don't remember." A chill crawled up her spine. She wanted to ask, to demand an explanation, but fear strangled the words in her throat. She had spent years loving him, yearning for him. And now, he stood before her, not as her husband, but as her executioner. The man she loved had married her not for love, but for revenge. And she had no idea why. She stood frozen in place, the weight of his words sinking into her like ice-cold daggers. Her wedding dress, once a symbol of love and happiness, now felt like a prison wrapped around her body. "You're lying," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I would never hurt you." His laugh was bitter. "Would never? You already did." He reached for a small drawer near the bed and pulled out a single photograph, tossing it onto the silk sheets between them. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. It was an old image, grainy, but clear enough. A young boy, beaten and bruised, staring blankly at the camera. His eyes held a haunting emptiness. She looked up at him in shock. This is you?" His jaw clenched. "Took you long enough." The memory was distant, blurred by time, but a sharp pain stabbed at her mind. She had seen this boy before. Somewhere. "You destroyed my family," he continued, his voice low and lethal. "And now, I will destroy you." She gasped, shaking her head violently. "No. I don't know what you're talking about. I don't remember." He took a slow step toward her, his presence suffocating. "That's the best part. You don't remember, but I do. Every single detail. And I've spent years waiting for this moment." Tears burned her eyes. She had loved him for so long. How could this be happening? "What did I do?" she pleaded. "Please tell me." His gaze darkened. "No. You don't deserve to know just yet. But don't worry." He leaned in close, his lips almost brushing her ear. "By the time I'm done with you, you'll remember everything." Her body trembled, a war raging inside her heart. Love, fear, guilt, confusion. What had she done? And more importantly, would she survive the truth? She couldn't sleep. The room was bathed in darkness, but her thoughts ran wild, refusing to settle. The warmth of the golden chandeliers and whispered wedding vows seemed like a cruel joke now, mocking her naive love. Her husband, her love, had just vowed to destroy her, and she had no idea why. Her fingers tightened around the photograph he had tossed at her, the image of the bruised boy burning into her memory. How could she have hurt him? She had never been the type to be cruel, never the type to destroy lives. Yet his words haunted her. You don't remember, but I do. If she was going to survive this, she needed answers. The next morning, she was alone. He had left without a word. Not that she expected warmth after last night's revelation, but the silence was suffocating. The emptiness of the house, once meant to be their shared home, felt more like a prison. She ran her fingers over the wedding band on her finger. A cruel joke. Determined, she got up and dressed, her mind set on one goal, finding out the truth. If she had wronged him, she needed to know how. Her first stop was the past. She went to the only place that might hold some records, her old family home. She hadn't been there in years. After her parents' deaths, the house had been locked away, untouched, waiting for a day she never had the heart to face. Standing before the large iron gates, she hesitated. She had spent her childhood here, her younger years filled with laughter and warmth. But now, the house held nothing but ghosts. The caretaker, an old man who had once served her family, greeted her with surprised eyes. "Miss, it's been so long." She nodded absently. "I need to look through some old records. Anything from 15 years ago?" The man frowned, but didn't question her. "Of course, the study is as you left it." She stepped inside, inhaling the faint scent of dust and forgotten time. The study was a small room lined with bookshelves, filled with stacks of papers and memories she had long since abandoned. Her fingers skimmed over the old drawers, pulling out faded files. There were business documents, personal letters, but nothing that explained what she had done. Until she found a name. His name. The file was yellowed with age, but the letters burned into her mind like a brand. Her fingers trembled as she flipped it open. And then she saw it. A police report, dated 15 years ago. Her heart pounded in her chest as she read the details, her breath hitching with every word. It was about a boy who had lost everything overnight. Her hands gripped the paper as the weight of the past came crashing down. She had been involved in ruining his life, but she still didn't understand how. That night, she sat alone in the darkness of her bedroom, the file clutched in her hands. She had found something, but not enough. She needed to know more. She needed to confront him. But what would he do when he realized she was remembering? Would he still destroy her? Or would he finally tell her the full truth? She wasn't sure she was ready to find out. She spent the entire night staring at the old police report. 15 years ago. That was how long it had been since she unknowingly changed his life forever. The file held little information, only that an incident had occurred, one that left a family shattered. The details were vague, almost as if someone had intentionally erased them. But one thing was clear. She was involved. And now, she was married to the very man who had spent years waiting to destroy her. The next morning, she found him waiting at the breakfast table, casually sipping his coffee as though nothing had happened. He didn't even glance at her when she entered, his posture relaxed, unreadable. "Sleep well?" he asked, his voice smooth, almost mocking. She swallowed, gripping the edge of the chair before sitting across from him. "Where were you last night?" His lips twitched into something resembling a smirk. "Why? Did you miss me?" She didn't answer. Instead, she slid the old police report onto the table between them. "I found this." Finally, he looked at her. His eyes flickered to the file, and for the briefest moment, something dark passed through his expression. Then he leaned back, utterly unfazed. "Digging through the past already?" Her fingers curled into fists. "You told me I ruined your life. But you won't tell me how. If you want to hurt me, shouldn't I at least know what I did?" His smirk disappeared. He set his coffee down, tilting his head as he studied her. "And if I don't tell you?" She met his gaze, refusing to waver. "Then I'll find out on my own." Something in his expression hardened. He was amused, but there was an edge to his amusement, a warning hidden beneath the surface. "I see." He stood, slowly circling the table, stopping just behind her chair. She felt his presence like a storm looming overhead. "You want the truth?" he murmured, his voice low, dangerous. "You won't like it." Her pulse pounded. "I still deserve to know." A slow exhale. Then, without warning, his hand curled around her chin, tilting her face up toward him. His grip wasn't bruising, but it was firm, possessive. His dark eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, she saw something beneath the hatred. Something raw. Then, just as quickly, it vanished. He let go. "Fine." Her breath hitched as he walked away, his voice casual, as if he were discussing something trivial. 15 years ago, I had a family, a home, a future." He turned slightly, looking at her over his shoulder. "And then, because of you, I lost it all." Her heart clenched. "But how? What did I do?" He laughed softly, but there was no warmth in it. "Figure it out, wife. Since you're so eager to play detective." With that, he left, leaving her with more questions than answers. She was running out of patience. Days passed, and no matter how much she tried to push him for answers, he refused to give her anything more. Instead, he seemed to enjoy watching her struggle, dangling the truth just out of reach. But she wouldn't stop. She had to know. And so, she returned to the one place she had been avoiding. Her family's old connections. It took time, but she finally found something. A name, a case file, and a hidden truth that shattered everything. 15 years ago, her father had been responsible for a devastating scandal. One that had destroyed an entire family's future. His family. And she had unknowingly played a part in covering it up. Her body went cold as she stared at the evidence. All this time, she had been living in ignorance while he had suffered. No wonder he hated her. She had stolen his happiness. And now he was going to do the same to her. That night, she returned home, finding him waiting as if he already knew what she had discovered. "So," he said, his voice eerily calm, "you finally remember." She gripped the file in her hands. "It was my father," she whispered. "Not me." His jaw clenched, his usual mask of control cracking for the first time. "And yet, you still lived a perfect life, while I had to crawl my way back from nothing." She shook her head. "I didn't know." He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "And does that make it better?" Tears burned her eyes. "If I could go back." "You can't," he snapped. "But you can suffer, just like I did." Her heart shattered at his words. Because for the first time she realized, he wasn't just trying to destroy her. He was trying to make her feel what he had felt. Loneliness, betrayal, and, worst of all, a love that could never be returned. She couldn't breathe. His words wrapped around her like chains, tightening with every passing second. "You can suffer just like I did." She wanted to scream, to tell him that she hadn't known, that she had been just as much a victim of her father's secrets. But what would that change? Nothing. Because the man standing before her didn't see her as an innocent bystander. He saw her as the reason for his downfall. Her hands trembled around the case file, the weight of the truth pressing down on her chest. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. A cruel smirk touched his lips. "I already told you." She swallowed hard. Revenge. His silence was answer enough. She wanted to run, to put as much distance between them as possible. But she was trapped. Not just in this house. In this marriage. In the twisted fate that bound them together. The days that followed were suffocating. He was no longer the man she had loved for years. The warmth she had once seen in his eyes was gone, replaced by something cold and merciless. He didn't hurt her physically. No, his cruelty was far more calculated. He would act the perfect husband in front of others, pulling out chairs for her, placing a hand on the small of her back, whispering sweet nothings in public. But the moment they were alone, the mask would fall. Silence. Indifference. A constant reminder that she was nothing more than a pawn in his game. And yet, there were moments. Fleeting, almost invisible, but there. A hesitation in his eyes when she looked too lost. A flicker of something, guilt, when she flinched at his cold words. A soft touch when he thought she wasn't paying attention. She didn't know what was more painful, his cruelty, or the remnants of the man she had once loved slipping through the cracks. One night, she found herself staring at the man beside her in bed. He was asleep, his face free of the hatred he carried when awake. In sleep, he looked almost peaceful, vulnerable. Her chest ached. She had spent so many years dreaming of a life with him, a future filled with love, laughter, and happiness. But now, that dream was shattered, twisted into something cruel and inescapable. Carefully, she reached out, fingers brushing against the scar near his temple. A mark from his past. A past she had unknowingly helped create. He stirred, and she quickly pulled back, her heart racing. For a brief moment, his gaze was soft, confused, until recognition set in. His expression hardened instantly. "Don't touch me." She swallowed the lump in her throat, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "You weren't always like this," she whispered. "I remember the way you used to look at me." Something dark flashed in his eyes. "That was before I knew who you really were." She shook her head.
"No."
"That was before you decided to hate me." His jaw clenched. "You think this is a choice?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Because if you truly only hated me, you wouldn't still be here." His breath hitched, but he quickly masked it with a scoff. "You're delusional." "Maybe." But deep down, she knew there was still something left. Something neither of them was ready to face. She had been waiting for the right moment. For weeks, she had been searching for something, anything, that would prove what she had suspected all along. And then, she found it, hidden in his study. A box, tucked away beneath old documents. Inside, she found letters, photos, pieces of a past he had tried to bury. Her heart pounded as she sifted through them, each one a painful confirmation of what she had begun to suspect. He had loved her. For years. Long before he had discovered the truth. Before hatred had consumed him. She held a letter, dated years ago. His handwriting was unmistakable. I don't know when it started. Maybe it was the way she laughed, or the way she always seemed to find the light even in the darkest moments. I should have hated her. I should have walked away the moment I learned the truth. But I couldn't. Because, despite everything, she was the only thing that ever felt real. Her hands shook as she read the words. He had loved her. And now, he was destroying her. She didn't know whether to laugh or cry. But one thing was clear. He wasn't just fighting to ruin her. He was fighting himself. And she was going to make him admit it, no matter what it took. She stood in front of him, gripping the letter tightly in her trembling hands. His letter, his confession, his secret, hidden away like a wound he refused to acknowledge. She had been prepared for his hatred, for his indifference, but not for this, the undeniable proof that his love had existed long before revenge had poisoned it. He stared at her, his expression carefully blank, but she saw it, the flicker of something dangerous in his eyes. Not rage. Not cold detachment. Fear. "You were lying," she whispered, holding the letter up between them. "All this time, you were lying."
His jaw tightened.
"Put that away." "No," her voice was steadier than she felt. "You said you never loved me, that you married me only for revenge. But this," she shook the paper, "this proves otherwise." His silence was suffocating. Then he turned away. "It doesn't matter." Her chest tightened. "It does matter. You spent years hating me, convincing yourself that you wanted to destroy me. But deep down, you knew the truth." He scoffed, but it sounded hollow. "And what truth is that?" She took a slow step forward. "That you never stopped loving me." His shoulders stiffened. For a moment, she thought he might admit it. That he would finally drop the act and tell her what she already knew. But then, he turned on her with eyes filled with something darker than before. "You think this changes anything?" She flinched. His voice was sharp, cutting through the fragile hope she had begun to hold on to. "Love doesn't erase the past," he continued, stepping closer. "It doesn't bring back what I lost. And it doesn't make you innocent." Her breath hitched. I never claimed to be innocent. He exhaled harshly, running a hand through his hair. You don't get it, do you? His voice was strained, as if he was barely holding himself together. Loving you ruined me once. I won't let it happen again. Her heart ached. She had always imagined love to be something soft, something warm and kind. But the love between them wasn't soft. It was jagged, raw, bleeding from wounds neither of them could heal. But if he thought she would walk away now, he was wrong. She had spent years loving him. And now, she would fight for him, even if he refused to fight for himself. The tension between them had reached a breaking point. Days passed, each one filled with unspoken words, lingering touches neither of them acknowledged, and stolen glances when they thought the other wasn't looking. She saw it in the way he hesitated when he walked past her, in the way his fingers curled into fists whenever she got too close. He was fighting it, fighting her, but she wouldn't let him win. Not this time. One night, she found him on the balcony, staring at the city lights below. She stepped beside him, close enough that their arms brushed. He didn't move away. I'm not going to leave, she said quietly. His jaw tensed. I never asked you to stay. She ignored the lie. You hate me for something I didn't do. And you love me despite everything. His head turned sharply, his eyes burning with a mix of emotions she couldn't decipher. Don't what? She whispered. Don't say it like that. Her fingers curled around the railing. Like what? Like love is enough to fix this. She swallowed hard. Maybe it's not, but it's real. His breath hitched. For the first time, she saw it, his carefully built walls crumbling, the battle raging inside him spilling into the open. But before she could say anything else, he turned away. We're done talking, he muttered, walking inside. But she had seen it. She had seen the way his hands trembled. She was getting closer. And soon, he wouldn't be able to run from the truth anymore. She waited until the storm inside him was too strong to ignore, until he could no longer hide behind his cold words and cruel actions. And then, she forced him to face it. She found him in his study, his back turned to her as he stared at the letter she had left on his desk. The letter he had written years ago. The proof he had tried to bury. She took a deep breath. You loved me first. His hands clenched into fists. It doesn't matter. It does. She stepped closer. You've spent years punishing me for something I didn't even know I was guilty of. But do you know what's worse? His silence was deafening. You've been punishing yourself. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. You don't understand. Then make me understand. His shoulders trembled. I can't. Yes, you can. She moved to stand in front of him, forcing him to meet her gaze. You're afraid, aren't you? His breath hitched. You want to hate me. You need to hate me. Because if you don't, she trailed off, watching the war in his eyes. If I don't, he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She swallowed, reaching up to touch his face. Then that means you've wasted all these years running from something that was always yours. A sharp inhale. He looked at her as if she was breaking him. And maybe, in a way, she was. But instead of pulling away, he did something else. Something unexpected. He crashed his lips against hers. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't soft.
It was raw, desperate.
A battle neither of them wanted to lose. She felt every ounce of his pain in that kiss, every year of torment and regret, every unsaid word and buried emotion. And when he finally pulled away, his forehead resting against hers, his voice was nothing more than a broken whisper. I never stopped loving you. Tears blurred her vision. Then stop running. A long pause. Then, finally, he let her pull him back into her arms. And for the first time in years, he let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, love could still win. The kiss was supposed to be the ending, but it wasn't. It was only the beginning. The beginning of something fragile, uncertain, and terrifyingly real. When he pulled away that night, the words, I never stopped loving you, still lingered in the air between them. A confession that neither of them had expected. She had thought that once the truth was spoken, things would change instantly. That the years of pain would dissolve, that he would finally hold her without hesitation. But love was never that easy. The morning after, she woke up to an empty bed. The sheets beside her were cold. A part of her had expected it. Love wasn't a magic cure. It didn't erase betrayal, real or imagined. It didn't undo the years they had spent hurting each other. She wrapped the blanket around herself and exhaled deeply. She had fought to break his walls. But now, she had to fight for something even harder, his trust. Days passed, and he remained distant. Not in the way he had before, not with cruelty, not with venom in his words, but with caution, a hesitance she wasn't sure how to break. He still looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, still lingered near her, his presence a ghost of something unfinished. But every time she tried to reach for him, he pulled away. One night, she found him in his study again, staring at the same letter that had unraveled everything. She stood in the doorway, watching the flickering candlelight cast shadows over his face. "You're still running," she said softly. His hand tightened around the edge of the letter, but he didn't turn to face her. "I'm not." "Then why do you keep pushing me away?" Silence. She stepped closer, slowly, as if approaching a wounded animal. "You can love me and still be afraid." His voice was quiet, almost broken. "You don't understand what it's like." "Then help me understand." His head turned slightly, just enough for her to see the raw emotion in his eyes. "I wanted revenge because it was easier than wanting you." Her breath hitched. "I built my life around hating you," he continued, his voice shaking. "It was the only way I knew how to survive." Tears burned in her eyes. "And now?" He exhaled shakily. "Now I don't know how to live without it." Her heart ached for him, for the years he had spent suffering, for the love he had tried so hard to bury. "You don't have to hate me anymore," she whispered. His eyes met hers, haunted and unsure. "But what if I don't know how to love you either?" Healing was never immediate. It came in small moments. Soft touches instead of bruising grips. Lingering gazes instead of cold stares. He didn't trust himself to hold her the way she deserved. And she didn't push. Instead, she stayed. When he had nightmares, she sat beside him until he fell asleep again. When he avoided touching her, she let him set the pace. When he tried to hide his emotions, she reminded him that he didn't have to. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she found him on the balcony again. This time, when she stepped beside him, he didn't move away. They stood in silence, the city stretching before them like an endless possibility. Then, slowly, carefully, he reached for her hand. Her fingers curled around his, without hesitation. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. It took weeks before he kissed her again. Not out of desperation, not out of anger or fear, but because he wanted to, because he chose to. She was in the garden when it happened, the scent of blooming roses filling the night air. He had been watching her, as he often did, with something unreadable in his eyes. She turned to him, tilting her head. "You're staring again." His lips twitched, barely a smile. "I know." She raised an eyebrow. "Are you going to say something or just—" He stepped forward, closing the space between them. Then, with deliberate slowness, he lifted his hand to cup her cheek. Her breath caught in her throat. This was different. There was no hesitation in his touch. No fear. Just him. Just them. And when he finally kissed her, it was soft. Gentle. Like he was relearning what love was supposed to feel like. Like he was finally letting go of the past. They weren't perfect. They had too much history, too many wounds that hadn't fully healed. But they had each other. And for the first time, that was enough. One evening, she found him sitting in their room, staring at something in his hands. A small velvet box. Her heart skipped a beat. She didn't move, waiting for him to speak. Finally, he looked up. "I don't deserve you," he murmured. She smiled softly. "That's not for you to decide." He exhaled, shaking his head. "You always were stubborn. And you always were a coward," she teased. His lips twitched. "Not anymore." Then, with quiet certainty, he opened the box. A ring. A second chance. A promise that they would learn together. He didn't kneel. Didn't say the words. He didn't have to. Because this wasn't a grand declaration of love. It was something deeper.
A choice.
A beginning. She reached out, taking the ring from him. Then, she slid it onto her own finger. "I'll stay," she whispered. And this time, he didn't stop her.